On November 5th, 2025, someone claiming to know what the institutions weren't telling us posted something that made the astronomy corners of the internet lose their minds. The username was simple, almost too simple: 3i Atlas Whistleblower. And their message was anything but calm. In all capitals, with the kind of urgency usually reserved for natural disasters or breaking geopolitical crises, they wrote, 3i Atlas just swerved to aim at Earth.
Let me back up for a second, because you need to understand why this particular claim sent shockwaves through communities that are normally pretty skeptical. 3i Atlas is the third confirmed interstellar object humanity has ever detected. Not the third asteroid this year, not the third comet from the Oort cloud, the third visitor from beyond our solar system in the entire history of recorded astronomy. It was discovered on July 1st, 2025, by the Atlas telescope array in Chile, part of a system designed to catch potentially hazardous near-Earth objects before they become, well, hazardous. But 3i Atlas wasn't from around here. Its trajectory showed what astronomers call a hyperbolic orbit, meaning it came from interstellar space, swung around our sun, and was headed back out into the cosmic void. The whistleblower's posts arrived with timestamps: October 29th, November 5th, each one escalating. They claimed that between these dates, the object had changed its orbital inclination by 1.4 degrees. Now, if you're not an orbital mechanics person, 1.4 degrees might sound like nothing, like adjusting your car's steering wheel just a hair to the right. But when you're talking about an object, potentially several kilometers across, moving at roughly 60 kilometers per second through the vacuum of space, a 1.4-degree shift in trajectory isn't subtle. It's enormous. It would require a force, an impulse, something generating thrust that conventional comet physics can't easily explain. The posts included hashtags: number 3, I Atlas, number UFOX, and they referenced something specific, MPEC 2025-N608. And for those who don't track these things, MPEC stands for Minor Planet Electronic Circular. It's the official bulletin system used by the Minor Planet Center at the Smithsonian to announce new discoveries and orbital updates for asteroids and comets. If MPEC 2025-N68 existed, it would be the smoking gun. The official confirmation that something genuinely weird had happened to 3i Atlas's trajectory. But here's where things get strange. When people started searching for this circular, they couldn't find it. The Minor Planet Center's public database showed MPEC 2025-N12, which announced 3i Atlas's initial discovery back in July. But N68, nothing. Silence. Either it didn't exist or someone wasn't sharing it with the rest of us. The emotional response split immediately into two camps. On one side, you had the people asking, what if this thing really is coming at us? Because the whistleblower wasn't just claiming a trajectory shift. They were claiming that 3i Atlas had repositioned itself into what they called dead center alignment with Earth on December 19, 2025. The language was apocalyptic. The implications were staggering. If an interstellar object could change its course mid-flight to target our planet, then either we were looking at something with intelligence behind it, or the laws of celestial mechanics as we understood them were missing something crucial. On the other side, you had the skeptics, and their questions were just as pointed. Where's the data? Why hasn't NASA issued a hazard warning? Why would the Minor Planet Center hide this? And most importantly, how would an object possibly generate the kind of force necessary to alter its trajectory by that much in just a few days? Comets can produce thrust throughout gassing, sure. When solar radiation heats up volatile ices on their surface, those ices turn to gas and jet outward, creating a small rocket effect. But 1.4 degrees in less than a week, that's not subtle outgassing. That's something else entirely. The official position from the institutions that actually track these things was frustratingly quiet, but clear in what little they did say. NASA's science pages described 3I Atlas as an active interstellar visitor.
The Planetary Society's tracking data showed its closest approach to Earth would be approximately 1.8 astronomical units. That's about 270 million kilometers. For context, the Sun is 1 astronomical unit from Earth, so even at its closest, 3I Atlas would be almost twice as far from us as we are from the Sun. Not exactly a collision course. No impact warning, no emergency press conferences, just the usual scientific monitoring of an unusual but non-threatening object. But the absence of alarm from official channels didn't calm anyone down. If anything, it fueled the fire.
Because in the age we live in, institutional silence can be interpreted 2 very different ways. Either there's nothing to worry about and they're right not to cause panic, or there's something they're not telling us and the silence is part of the cover-up. Guess which interpretation gets more traction online? The whistleblower had one more tagline that kept appearing in their posts, and it's the phrase that arguably did more to spread the story than anything else. No gas, no tail, just thrust. 3 words that suggested something profoundly unnatural was happening. Because if 3I Atlas didn't have the visual signatures of a normal comet, if it wasn't producing the coma of gas and dust that typically surrounds these objects when they get close to the Sun, then what exactly was propelling it, and why would it suddenly change direction? So here we are, an interstellar object that's either behaving exactly as the science predicts, or doing something that shouldn't be possible. A whistleblower claiming orbital shifts that official databases don't confirm. A date looming on the calendar, December 19th, 2025, the supposed moment of alignment.
And somewhere between panic and skepticism, the rest of us trying to figure out what's real. Did 3-eyed Atlas really swerve toward Earth? Or are we watching a masterclass in how viral claims can outpace verified data? That's what we're here to untangle. Because the truth, whatever it turns out to be, matters. And the only way to find it is to dig into the data, examine the physics, and understand both what this object actually is and what it represents in the broader story of humanity looking up at the sky and wondering what's looking back.
So let's start with the numbers that supposedly prove everything. The whistleblower's posts weren't just dramatic prose and alarming hashtags. They included specifics, numbers, orbital parameters, the kind of technical detail that gives a claim the appearance of credibility, even when that credibility might not hold up under scrutiny. According to the screenshots circulating online, 3I Atlas's orbital inclination had shifted from 284.3 degrees to 287.8 degrees.
The inclination parameter measures how tilted an orbit is relative to the ecliptic plane, which is basically the flat disk that Earth and most planets orbit within. A change of 3.5 degrees in inclination happening rapidly would be seismic in orbital mechanics terms. To understand why, imagine you're driving down a highway and suddenly your lane tilts upward by several degrees. For a car going 60 miles per hour, that's manageable if it happens gradually. But if it happens instantly, you're dealing with forces that could tear the vehicle apart.
Now scale that up to an object moving 60 kilometers per second, potentially weighing billions of tons. The energy required to change its trajectory by 1.4 degrees in the span of days isn't just large, it's almost incomprehensibly large. You'd need either sustained thrust from some kind of engine or a sudden impulse, like a collision or explosion. And neither of those options fit neatly with what we know about how comets behave. Let's talk about what the actual verified data tells us.
According to NASA's tracking and the scientific papers analyzing 3I Atlas, this object is on a hyperbolic orbit with an eccentricity of approximately 6.14. Eccentricity is a measure of how stretched out an orbit is. A circle has an eccentricity of 0. Earth's orbit is slightly elliptical at 0.017. Anything above 1 is hyperbolic, meaning the object isn't bound to the sun's gravity and will escape the solar system. 6.14 is wildly hyperbolic.
This thing came from interstellar space, picked up a gravitational slingshot from the sun, and is headed back out. It's a visitor, not a resident. The perihelion, the point where 3I Atlas came closest to the sun, occurred on October 29, 2025, at a distance of about 1.4 astronomical units. That puts it roughly between Earth's orbit and Mars's orbit at its closest solar approach. From there, the trajectory calculations show it moving outward, passing relatively near Earth's orbital path around December 19th, but at that safe distance of 1.8 astronomical units.
270 million kilometers is a lot of empty space. You could fit more than 600 Earths end-to-end in that gap. So where does the 1.4-degree tilt claim come from? If the official data shows a stable hyperbolic trajectory with no sudden changes, how did someone arrive at the conclusion that 3I Atlas swerved? There are a few possibilities worth considering, and none of them involve a conspiracy to hide the truth. First, orbital calculations for interstellar objects are genuinely difficult, especially early in the observation period.
When 3I Atlas was first discovered, astronomers had only a short arc of its trajectory to work with. Short arc means limited data points, which means higher uncertainty in the calculated orbit. As more observations came in over July, August, and September, the orbital parameters would have been refined. Small adjustments are normal. An object that initially looked like it had an inclination of 284 degrees might, after more precise measurements, actually be at 285 degrees. That's not the object changing course. That's us getting better at measuring where it was going all along.
Second, there's the difference between amateur observations and professional datasets. Amateur astronomers do incredible work, and some of the most important discoveries in the field have come from dedicated hobbyists with backyard telescopes. But tracking an interstellar object requires extremely precise measurements, accounting for parallax, atmospheric distortion, timing errors, and a dozen other factors that can introduce noise into the data. If an amateur tracker misreads a coordinate or uses slightly outdated orbital elements, they might calculate a trajectory that looks different from the professional consensus. That difference might get interpreted as a sudden shift when it's actually just measurement uncertainty. Third, and this is crucial, even professional tracking of these objects involves assumptions and corrections. 3I Atlas is not a single point of light. If it has a coma, a cloud of gas and dust around its nucleus, then the exact center of that coma might shift slightly as the object rotates or as outgassing occurs. Observers might be measuring slightly different points on the object over time, which can create the appearance of trajectory variations that aren't actually there.
The data sidebar for 3I Atlas, based on confirmed scientific sources, looks like this. Discovery date, July 1st, 2025. Discoverer, Atlas Survey in Chile. Perihelion, October 29th, 2025, at approximately 1.4 astronomical units. Closest approach to Earth, December 19th, 2025, at approximately 1.8 astronomical units. Eccentricity, approximately 6.14, confirming hyperbolic trajectory. Nucleus radius estimates somewhere between 0.44 kilometers and 2.8 kilometers, though these measurements have significant uncertainty. Activity level, confirmed active with observed coma and tail. Spectroscopic analysis, carbon dioxide-rich composition, detected by James Webb Space Telescope observations. None of that data suggests an object that suddenly changed course. What it suggests is a fairly typical, albeit interstellar, comet doing comet things. It's outgassing as it approaches the sun. It has a tail. It's on a trajectory that was determined by whatever gravitational interactions sent it flying out of its home star system millions or billions of years ago, plus the minor modifications from our sun's gravity and its own outgassing effects.
But the absence of evidence for a sudden shift doesn't automatically disprove the whistleblower's claim, at least not to everyone. Because the counter-argument goes like this: if there was a sudden shift, and if certain observations or orbital updates were restricted or delayed in publication, then the absence of public confirmation isn't proof of absence, it's proof of suppression. Which brings us to the question that haunts Every conspiracy theory in the information age. How do you tell the difference between the data doesn't support this claim and the data is being hidden? The answer, frustratingly, is that you can't always tell from the outside. What you can do is look at the credibility of the sources, the consistency of the data, and the plausibility of the physics. And on all three counts, the official position holds up better than the whistleblower's claims. But that doesn't make the story any less interesting, because even if 3i Atlas didn't suddenly swerve, the question of why someone would claim it did and why that claim spread so rapidly tells us something important about how we process information about potential threats from space. So, either the data is wrong, or someone is misreading it, or there's something more complex happening that we haven't figured out yet. Which leads us directly to the next piece of the puzzle. The cryptic tagline that appeared in almost every whistleblower post. The phrase that suggested 3i Atlas might not be a comet at all. No gas, no tail, just thrust. There's a reason this phrase stuck. It's punchy, it's ominous, and it implies something that most of us find deeply unsettling. The possibility that 3i Atlas isn't following the rules we thought governed objects flying through space. When the whistleblower kept repeating, no gas, no tail, just thrust, they were making a very specific claim about what this object was not showing. And in the process, they were suggesting what it might be instead. Let's start with the basics of how comets work, because understanding that makes the no gas, no tail claim either damning or absurd, depending on what the actual observations show. Comets are often described as dirty snowballs, which is a decent analogy even if it oversimplifies things. They're made of rock, dust, and frozen volatiles like water ice, carbon dioxide ice, methane, ammonia, and various other compounds that stay solid in the cold depths of space. When a comet gets closer to the sun, solar radiation starts heating up its surface. Those frozen volatiles sublimate, meaning they go directly from solid to gas without passing through a liquid phase. That gas expands outward, carrying dust particles with it, and you get a coma, the fuzzy cloud surrounding the nucleus, and often a tail that points away from the sun due to solar wind and radiation pressure. This process is visible. It's one of the defining characteristics of comets. When you see a comet in the night sky with a glowing tail stretching across the darkness, you're watching sunlight reflecting off millions of tiny dust particles being blown away from the nucleus. It's beautiful, and it's also a natural consequence of physics. Ice melts, or in this case, sublimates, when you heat it up. There's nothing mysterious about it. So when someone says, no gas, no tail, they're claiming that 3i Atlas isn't behaving like a typical comet. They're suggesting it's not producing the visible signs of outgassing that we'd expect from an icy body getting warmed by the sun. And if it's not producing gas and dust, but it's still somehow generating thrust, changing its trajectory, then what exactly is propelling it? Here's the problem. The official observations of 3i Atlas completely contradict the no gas, no tail narrative. NASA's science pages describe it as an active object. Multiple telescopes, including the Hubble Space Telescope and the James Webb Space Telescope, have observed it and confirmed the presence of a coma. Spectroscopic analysis from JWST specifically detected a carbon dioxide-rich coma, meaning there is absolutely gas being released. Size estimates for the nucleus vary pretty widely, from about 440 meters up to 5.6 kilometers, depending on the method and assumptions used, but the presence of activity is not in dispute among the professional astronomy community. There's even a tail. It's been photographed. It's been measured. It shows the classic characteristics of a comet tail, material streaming away from the sun, not toward it. So where does the no gas, no tail claim even come from? There are a few possibilities. Maybe the whistleblower was looking at observations from a specific time period when the tail wasn't visible from Earth's vantage point.
Maybe they were relying on early data before the coma fully developed. Or maybe they were deliberately misrepresenting what they were seeing to make the story more dramatic. But let's entertain the idea for a moment. Let's say hypothetically that at some point 3I Atlas did exhibit behavior that couldn't be explained by normal comet outgassing. What would that look like? To answer that, we need to talk about 1I/Oumuamua, the first confirmed interstellar object detected back in 2017. Oumuamua was weird. It was moving faster than expected. It had a non-gravitational acceleration, meaning it sped up slightly in a way that gravity alone couldn't account for. The most accepted explanation for this is outgassing, similar to what comets do. But here's the catch. Astronomers didn't detect any visible coma or tail around Oumuamua. No dust, no obvious gas emissions. This led to all kinds of speculation. Maybe Oumuamua was shaped like a thin pancake or cigar, which would allow radiation pressure from the sun to push on it more effectively. Maybe it was releasing pure hydrogen gas that's invisible to our telescopes. Or maybe, and this is where things get spicy, it was something artificial. A light sail, a probe. A craft deliberately maneuvering through our solar system. Avi Loeb, a prominent Harvard astrophysicist, has been one of the most vocal proponents of considering the artificial hypothesis for Oumuamua. His argument, simplified, is that we shouldn't dismiss the possibility of extraterrestrial technology just because it seems unlikely. If we only ever look for natural explanations, we'll never recognize artificial ones, even if they're staring us in the face. Loeb's ideas have been controversial, to put it mildly. Most astronomers think Oumuamua is best explained as a weird comet, or maybe a fragment of a shattered planet. But the debate hasn't gone away. 3I Atlas sits somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. Unlike Oumuamua, it does have a visible coma and tail, so the no bass part of the whistleblower's tagline is flatly wrong based on current observations. But what about the just thrust part? Is there any evidence that 3A Atlas is accelerating or decelerating in ways that normal outgassing can't explain? Non-gravitational forces on comets are actually pretty common. When gas jets out of a rotating comet nucleus, it creates a tiny rocket effect. Over time, these jets can noticeably alter the comet's trajectory. Astronomers account for this when calculating orbital predictions. It's not mysterious, it's just physics. The question is whether the magnitude of any non-gravitational acceleration on 3I Atlas is consistent with what we'd expect from a comet of its size and activity level, or whether it's doing something more extreme. The spectroscopic findings add another layer. The JWST study found unusually high carbon dioxide relative to water in the coma. That's interesting because most solar system comets are dominated by water ice. A carbon dioxide-rich composition suggests 3I Atlas might have formed in a colder, more distant environment than typical comets in our system. Maybe it came from the outer regions of another star's planetary disk, where carbon dioxide could condense more readily. That would make it chemically distinct but still perfectly natural. So if there is gas and there is a tail, the no gas, no tail claim falls apart, unless we're missing some crucial context. Could the whistleblower have been referencing a later period after 3I Atlas passed perihelion and the outgassing reduced as it moved farther from the sun? Possibly, but that wouldn't explain the just thrust part unless there was documented evidence of continued acceleration after the outgassing stopped, and no such evidence has been made public by credible sources. This is where speculation inevitably creeps in. What if 3I Atlas had some kind of hidden propulsion mechanism? What if it used a photon sail, harnessing sunlight for thrust in a way that wouldn't produce visible gas emissions? What if it's being maneuvered by something we don't understand? These questions are fun to ask, and they tap into our deep-seated desire for the universe to be weirder and more alive than we typically give it credit for. But asking the questions isn't the same as having evidence for the answers. The bigger conversation here is about how we distinguish between natural and artificial. Because the truth is, we're still learning what natural looks like when it comes to interstellar objects.
We've seen 3 of them now. That's not a large sample size.
Maybe carbon dioxide-rich comets are common in other star systems. Maybe objects with unusual acceleration are typical for certain formation environments. Or maybe, just maybe, we're looking at something that challenges the boundary between natural and engineered. We won't know until we gather more data, and more importantly, until we're willing to consider multiple hypotheses without jumping to conclusions. The whistleblower's tagline works because it preys on uncertainty. No gas, no tail, just thrust. It sounds definitive. It sounds like someone who knows something the rest of us don't.
But when you check that claim against the actual observations, it doesn't hold up. Three-eyed Atlas has gas, it has a tail, and any thrust it's generating can likely be explained by normal comet physics. But the phrase did its job. It planted a seed of doubt, and that seed has grown into a full-blown mystery in the minds of people who want to believe we're on the verge of discovering something extraordinary. So where does that leave us?
With an object that looks like a comet, acts like a comet, and is probably just a comet from another star system doing what comets do. But with a narrative suggesting it's something more, something potentially directed, something heading toward us with intent. And the only way to figure out which story is true is to look at who's telling it, why they're telling it, and what happens when institutions refuse to engage with the claims directly, which is exactly where we're going next. Every good conspiracy needs a mysterious source, someone on the inside.
Someone who knows what they're not supposed to know and decides to tell the world anyway. In this case, that someone is 3i Atlas Whistleblower, a social media account that appeared seemingly out of nowhere and started making claims that most astronomers would consider extraordinary without the extraordinary evidence to back them up. The persona is exactly what you'd expect from a modern online whistleblower. Urgent, capitalized text, screenshots that look official enough to be plausible, but not official enough to be easily verified.
The tone oscillates between "I'm trying to warn you" and "I told you so," which is pretty standard for accounts that position themselves as truth-tellers against institutional silence. The posts started showing up in late October and early November of 2025, coinciding with 3i Atlas's perihelion passage, and they've continued sporadically since then, always with the same core message. This object changed course, it's aimed at Earth, and nobody in power is telling you the truth. Let's look at some of the specific posts.
One of the early ones read, "This is fact," in all capitals, and tagged NASA's official account. It included a claim that Three-Eyed Atlas had undergone a measurable orbital shift and that the data was being suppressed. Another post was a poll asking followers, "Will full disclosure come before December 19th?" The options were yes or no, with a cheeky third option of, "They'll never tell us." The framing is classic conspiratorial rhetoric.
It assumes there's something to disclose. It assumes there's a they who are actively hiding it. And it assumes the people reading the poll are smart enough to see through the lies while everyone else remains blind. The whistleblower also referenced MPEC 2020-N68 multiple times, presenting it as the smoking gun document that proves the orbital shift. They included what looked like observational data, orbital elements, and timestamps. To someone without a background in orbital mechanics, it all looks legitimate. Numbers, dates, technical jargon, the kind of thing that a real insider might leak. But when you try to verify MPC 2025-N68 through official channels, you hit a wall. It's not in the Minor Planet Center's public database. It's not referenced in any peer-reviewed papers. It's not mentioned on any space agency's website. It either doesn't exist, or it's been restricted in a way that previous circulars have not been. The institutional response to these claims has been, for the most part, silence. NASA hasn't issued a rebuttal. The European Space Agency hasn't released a statement.
The Minor Planet Center hasn't clarified whether N68 is real or fake, and that silence is arguably the most interesting part of the story, because silence can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on your priors.
If you trust institutions, silence means the claims aren't credible enough to warrant a response. If you distrust institutions, silence means they're hiding something and hoping the story dies down before anyone asks too many questions. There's a psychology to how whistleblower narratives function in space anomaly subcultures.
We've seen it with UFO disclosure movements, with claims about secret space programs, with allegations that governments have recovered alien technology and are keeping it from the public. The pattern is always the same. Someone with a plausibly insider-sounding identity makes a claim that's difficult to verify. The claim gets amplified by communities that are already predisposed to believe the worst about institutional transparency. Official sources either ignore it or issue a bland denial that doesn't address the specifics, and the ambiguity in the middle becomes fertile ground for speculation.
What makes 3i Atlas different is that it's not about recovered technology or classified documents. It's about an object in space that anyone with a decent telescope can theoretically observe. Amateur astronomy groups around the world have access to the tools needed to track this thing and calculate its orbit. So if the whistleblower's claims were accurate, you'd expect independent confirmation from multiple sources, skywatchers who aren't affiliated with NASA or the ESA or any government agency, people who have no reason to participate in a cover-up. And yet, that confirmation hasn't materialized. Amateur observers who've tried to replicate the claimed 1.4-degree shift haven't found it in their own data. Public tracking tools like JPL Horizons, which anyone can access, show 3i Atlas following a stable, hyperbolic trajectory with no sudden deviations. That doesn't prove the whistleblower is wrong, but it does make their claims harder to sustain. Because if this shift really happened, and the data is being suppressed by official channels, then amateur astronomers should be able to see it independently.
The fact that they're not seeing it suggests either the shift didn't happen, or it's so subtle that it falls within the noise of measurement uncertainty. Let's map out the timeline to get a sense of how this story unfolded. July 1st, 2025. 3i Atlas is discovered by the Atlas survey. The initial observations confirm it's on a hyperbolic orbit, meaning it's interstellar. July through September, additional observations refine the orbital parameters. The object shows activity consistent with a comet, including a developing coma.
October 29, 2025, 3i Atlas reaches perihelion, its closest approach to the Sun. This is when you'd expect maximum outgassing and the most dramatic visible features like a tail. Late October into early November, the whistleblower account starts posting, claiming a sudden orbital shift occurred around this time. December 19, 2025, the predicted date of closest approach to Earth at 1.8 astronomical units. This is the moment the whistleblower claims represents dead center alignment. The question of motive is tricky. Why would someone create this narrative?
There are a few possibilities, none of them mutually exclusive. Maybe the whistleblower genuinely misread or misunderstood some orbital data and convinced themselves they'd discovered something important. Maybe they're part of a community that closely tracks these objects and became convinced that mainstream sources are missing or hiding key information. Maybe they're seeking attention, and a dramatic claim about an interstellar object aiming at Earth is a guaranteed way to get it. Or maybe they're part of a deliberate disinformation campaign, though that seems less likely given the relatively niche nature of the subject matter.
What's clear is that the narrative taps into something primal. The fear that something from out there, something we don't control and can't predict, might be heading our way. Combine that with distrust of institutions, a dash of apocalyptic thinking, and the virality of social media, and you've got a story that spreads faster than any official rebuttal ever could. The silence from NASA and other agencies might simply reflect a pragmatic calculation. Responding to every viral claim about space threats would be a full-time job, and it might actually amplify the claims by giving them more attention. Or it might reflect something more concerning, a genuine uncertainty about how to communicate nuanced scientific information in an environment where nuance is often interpreted as evasiveness. The object is not a threat, but we're still refining the orbit sounds wishy-washy, even if it's accurate. The object changed course, but only by a tiny amount that's within expected parameters, sounds like a cover-up, even if it's not. And so we arrive at the core debate. Natural versus artificial. Random comet versus purposeful probe.
The next part of this story hinges on that question, because if 3I Atlas is just a chunk of ice and rock from another star system, then the whistleblower's claims are either mistaken or fabricated. But if it's something else, something that can maneuver, something with intent, then maybe the silence isn't about dismissing a baseless claim. Maybe it's about buying time to figure out what we're actually dealing with before causing a panic. Let's examine the physics for it.
At the center of this entire saga is a question that feels almost too big to ask seriously. Is 3I Atlas a natural object, or is it something else? Because if you strip away the drama and the speculation and the whistleblower's claims, that's what we're really debating. Either this is a comet from another star system, strange perhaps, but ultimately explicable within the laws of physics we already know, or it's something that challenges those laws, something made, something directed, something with a purpose. The natural explanation is straightforward and in many ways comforting. 3I Atlas is a comet. It formed billions of years ago in the planetary disk of another star, probably in the cold outer regions where volatiles like carbon dioxide and water could condense. At some point, gravitational interactions with a planet or a passing star kicked it out of its home system and sent it drifting through interstellar space. Eventually, by sheer chance, it wandered into our solar system.
Our sun's gravity bent its trajectory, heating it up as it approached perihelion and causing the ices on its surface to sublimate, creating the coma and tail that telescopes have observed. It's following a hyperbolic orbit because it has enough velocity to escape the sun's gravitational pull. And once it swings past us, it'll head back out into the void, never to return. This explanation is consistent with everything we know about comets and interstellar objects. The JWST spectroscopy showing a carbon dioxide-rich composition, that fits with formation in a cold, distant protoplanetary disk. The observed coma and tail? That's what happens when sunlight heats up a comet. The hyperbolic trajectory? That's the signature of an interstellar visitor. The size estimates, somewhere between a few hundred meters and a few kilometers, are within the range of what we'd expect for a comet nucleus. There's no need to invoke anything exotic or unprecedented. But then there's Oumuamua, and Oumuamua refuses to fit neatly into the just a comet box. Oumuamua, the first confirmed interstellar object, detected in October of 2017, looked more like an asteroid than a comet at first. No visible coma.
No tail, but it exhibited a small non-gravitational acceleration, meaning it was speeding up in a way that gravity alone couldn't account for. The most widely accepted explanation is that it was outgassing in a way that wasn't producing visible dust, maybe releasing pure hydrogen or nitrogen gas that our telescopes couldn't detect. But the outgassing hypothesis has problems. The amount of gas you'd need to produce the observed acceleration would have required a significant portion of Oumuamua's mass to be volatile ices. And if that were the case, you'd expect at least some dust to be released along with the gas. Yet none was seen. This opened the door for alternative explanations. Avi Loeb proposed that Oumuamua might have been a light sail, a thin artificial structure designed to catch photons from a star and use them for propulsion. Light sails are a real technology. We've even tested small-scale versions in space. The Planetary Society's light sail missions demonstrated that solar radiation pressure can be used to propel a spacecraft. If Oumuamua had a large surface area relative to its mass, similar to a sail, then radiation pressure from the sun could explain its acceleration without requiring outgassing. The problem with this hypothesis is that it requires Oumuamua to be extremely thin, like a pancake or a sheet of paper, which is an unusual shape for a natural object, but exactly what you'd expect for an engineered sail. Loeb's argument, which he's written about extensively, is that we should be willing to consider the possibility of extraterrestrial technology. The galaxy is
billions of years old. Stars have planetary systems. Some of those planets are probably habitable. If even a tiny fraction of those habitable planets develop technological civilizations, and even a tiny fraction of those civilizations build interstellar probes, then statistically there should be artificial objects passing through our solar system from time to time. We've just never had the telescopes sensitive enough to detect them until recently. From this perspective, it's not that Oumuamua must be artificial, but that we shouldn't dismiss the hypothesis without serious consideration. Most astronomers disagree with Loeb's interpretation. They point to the natural explanations as more parsimonious, requiring fewer unsupported assumptions. But the debate hasn't ended, and 3I Atlas has reignited it. Because if 3I Atlas really did change its trajectory in the way that whistleblower claims, then we're right back to the same question.
Can natural processes explain a 1.4-degree shift in a matter of days? Or do we need to consider the possibility of artificial maneuvering? Let's do the physics. If 3I Atlas has a mass on the order of billions of tons, which is plausible for an object several kilometers across, and it's moving at roughly 60 kilometers per second, then changing its trajectory by 1.4 degrees would require an enormous amount of momentum transfer. We're talking about forces that would be visible.
If it were outgassing jets powerful enough to produce that kind of shift, you'd see dramatic asymmetries in the coma, bright plumes of material streaming off the nucleus, maybe even fragmentation as the internal stresses tore pieces of the object apart. Comets can produce thrust through outgassing, but there are limits. The comet has to have enough volatile material, the heating has to be strong enough to sublimate it rapidly, and the jets have to be oriented in a way that produces net acceleration rather than just spinning the nucleus.
A 1.4-degree shift in days is at the extreme end of what might be possible for a natural comet, and even then, you'd expect to see obvious evidence of the outgassing responsible. But here's the catch. We haven't seen that evidence. The observations of 3I Atlas show a relatively normal-looking comet. Active, yes. Producing a coma and tail, absolutely, but not exhibiting the kind of dramatic, asymmetric, explosive outgassing that would be necessary to explain a sudden trajectory change of that magnitude. Which brings us back to the measurement question. If the observations don't show extreme activity and the orbit hasn't actually shifted in the way claimed, then the whole premise collapses. The natural explanation holds, because there's nothing that needs an artificial explanation. Unless, of course, the observations we're seeing are incomplete or misleading. There are a few ways this could happen. Maybe 3I Atlas had a brief burst of activity, a sudden outgassing event, or even a small impact that occurred when it wasn't being actively observed. Space is big, and we're not watching every object every single moment. If something happened during a gap in observation coverage, we might miss it. Or maybe there's some form of propulsion that doesn't produce visible signatures. A photon sail, for instance, wouldn't create gas or dust. It would just reflect sunlight. If 3I Atlas had a reflective surface or a geometry that amplified radiation pressure, it could theoretically produce thrust without looking like a typical comet. But that would require the object to be artificially constructed, which is a massive leap from comet with unusual activity.
There's also been some speculation, largely confined to fringe forums and social media, about unusual spectroscopic features. One claim that circulated suggested 3I Atlas showed nickel-rich emissions, which would be weird for a comet, but potentially consistent with metallic components. The source for this claim appears to be a tabloid article that didn't cite any peer-reviewed research, so it's difficult to assess its credibility. Nickel is present in some asteroids, particularly metallic ones, but finding it in significant concentrations in a comet would be unusual.
It wouldn't necessarily prove artificial origin, but it would raise questions about how and where the object formed. The broader scientific reward for determining whether 3I Atlas is natural or artificial is staggering. If it's natural,
We're learning about the composition and behavior of comets from other star systems, which tells us about planetary formation and evolution beyond our planetary neighborhood. If it's artificial, we've just detected the first confirmed example of extraterrestrial technology. Not radio signals, not microbial fossils on a meteorite, an actual functioning object created by another civilization.
The implications would rewrite not just astronomy, but philosophy, history, theology, everything we think we know about humanity's place in the cosmos. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and right now the evidence points toward natural. The spectroscopy shows volatiles consistent with comet ices. The activity shows coma and tail formation consistent with solar heating. The orbit, while hyperbolic and therefore interstellar, follows the gravitational physics we'd expect. If there's a sudden trajectory shift, it hasn't been confirmed by independent observations. If there's unusual propulsion, it hasn't produced detectable signatures that can't be explained by normal comet processes. The voices on both sides of this debate reflect fundamentally different approaches to uncertainty. Mainstream astronomers, the ones publishing in peer-reviewed journals and working in major observatories, tend toward conservatism. They'll consider unusual hypotheses when the data demands it. But until then, they stick with the simplest explanations. Comets outgas. Interstellar objects follow hyperbolic trajectories. Measurement errors happen. Nothing about 3I Atlas requires us to invoke anything beyond established physics. On the other side, you have researchers like Loeb and communities of amateur astronomers and UFO enthusiasts who argue that conservatism has its own costs. If we never seriously investigate the possibility of artificial objects, we'll miss them even when they're right in front of us. Oumuamua might have been our first confirmed interstellar visitor, and we let it leave the solar system without sending a probe to study it up close. If 3I Atlas is something extraordinary, and we dismiss it as just another comet, we'll have made the same mistake twice. The question for you, listening to this, is which worldview resonates? Do you lean toward the natural explanation, the one that requires the fewest assumptions and fits comfortably within our current understanding of physics? Or do you lean toward the possibility, however remote, that we're looking at something engineered, something sent, something that doesn't belong in the category of random cosmic debris? There's no wrong answer, but there are implications to each position. If you assume natural until proven otherwise, you'll be right most of the time, but might miss something genuinely anomalous. If you assume anomalous until proven natural, you'll chase a lot of false leads, but might catch something extraordinary. Science tries to balance these risks by demanding strong evidence before accepting revolutionary claims. But the nature of revolutionary claims is that the evidence often looks ambiguous at first, and by the time it's conclusive, the opportunity to study the object might have passed. So we're left in this uncomfortable middle ground. 3I Atlas looks like a comet. It acts like a comet. The simplest explanation is that it is a comet. But there's this whisper of doubt, fueled by a whistleblower claiming trajectory shifts and institutional silence, and the memory of Oumuamua's weirdness, that maybe, just maybe, we're not seeing the whole picture. And the only way to resolve that doubt is to dig into the data shadows, the missing circulars, the amateur tracking attempts, and ask why the claimed orbital shift hasn't shown up in the places where it should be visible if it were real. That's what we're headed next.
If you want to understand why the 3I Atlas story has gained so much traction, you need to understand MPEC 2020-N68. Or more accurately, you need to understand why nobody can find it. Because at the heart of the whistleblower's claims is this specific reference to an official minor planet electronic circular that supposedly documents the orbital shift, the trajectory change, the moment when 3I Atlas stopped being a predictable interstellar visitor and became something else. And that circular, by all appearances, doesn't exist in the public record.
Minor planet electronic circulars are the lifeblood of small-body tracking in our solar system. They're published by the Minor Planet Center, which operates under the auspices of the International Astronomical Union and is hosted by the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. When a new asteroid or comet is discovered, an MPEC announces it. When orbital parameters get refined based on new observations, an MPEC updates them. When an object does something unexpected, an MPEC documents it. These circulars are public, they're archived, they're searchable.
They're designed to be transparent because the whole point of the Minor Planet Center is to coordinate global observations and ensure everyone's working from the same data. The circular that announced 3i Atlas's discovery was MPEC 2025-N12, published in July of 2025. It contained the preliminary orbital elements, the discovery circumstances, the designation that confirmed this was an interstellar object based on its hyperbolic eccentricity, everything you'd expect from a routine announcement of an extraordinary find.
Since then, there have probably been additional circulars refining the orbit as more observations came in, which is standard procedure. But none of those circulars, at least none that are publicly accessible, document a sudden 1.4-degree trajectory shift occurring in late October or early November. And yet the whistleblower keeps referencing N68. They post screenshots that look like they could be excerpts from an MPEC, with formatted orbital elements and observation timestamps. They cite it as proof. They tell people to check MPC 2025-N68, as if it's readily available and everyone else is just too lazy or too complicit to acknowledge it. But when people do check, when they search the Minor Planet Center's database, when they comb through astronomical mailing lists and archive sites, N68 isn't there. So what are the possibilities? Let's walk through them methodically. First, the circular never existed, and the whistleblower fabricated it. This is the simplest explanation, and arguably the most likely. Creating a fake MPEC wouldn't be difficult for someone with basic knowledge of the format and the willingness to make up numbers. The screenshots could be photoshopped or generated from scratch. The goal would be to lend credibility to the trajectory shift claim by anchoring it to something that sounds official. People see MPEC 2025-N68 and assume it's real because why would someone make up something so specific and so easily checked? Except it's only easily checked if you actually go looking, and most people don't.
They see the reference, they assume it's legitimate, and they move on. Second possibility, the circular existed but was retracted. This happens occasionally in astronomy when preliminary data turns out to be wrong. An object gets announced, then additional observations show it was a duplicate of something already cataloged, or the orbit was miscalculated, or it wasn't actually what people thought it was. In those cases, the Minor Planet Center can issue a correction or even pull a circular from active listings. But retractions are rare, and they're usually accompanied by an explanation.
There's no record of a retraction for N68, which makes this explanation less plausible. Plus, even retracted circulars tend to remain accessible in archives because transparency matters in science. You don't want to memory hole mistakes. You want to document them so people understand why the data changed. Third possibility, and this is where conspiracy thinking really takes hold, the circular is real but is being suppressed. Maybe it was issued internally to a limited group of professional astronomers. Maybe it contains information that space agencies decided was too sensitive to release publicly.
Maybe there's a coordinated effort to keep the trajectory shift quiet until someone figures out what to do about it. This explanation requires a level of coordination and secrecy that's difficult to maintain in the modern era. The Minor Planet Center works with astronomers from dozens of countries. Data flows through multiple institutions. Keeping something like a sudden orbital shift secret would require hundreds of people to stay silent, and in the age of leaks and whistleblowers, that seems implausible. But it's not impossible. And that tiny sliver of not impossible is enough to keep the theory alive.
Amateur observers have tried to verify the shift independently using public tracking tools. JPL Horizons, run by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, provides orbital data for solar system objects and allows you to calculate positions and trajectories. If 3i Atlas had shifted by 1.4 degrees in late October, that change should be reflected in the Horizons database, as it incorporates updated observations. But the trajectory shown in Horizons has remained consistent with a stable hyperbolic orbit. No sudden jumps, no unexplained deviations. Either the shift didn't happen, or the observations capturing it haven't been incorporated into the public databases yet. There's also the question of how orbital data actually gets from telescopes to public databases. It's not instantaneous. Observers submit their measurements to the Minor Planet Center, which then calculates or refines the orbit and issues circulars as needed. This process can take days or even weeks, depending on the object and the complexity of the observations. If there were a sudden shift, you'd expect a flurry of observations as different telescopes around the world tried to confirm it.
You'd expect discussions on astronomical mailing lists. You'd expect professional papers being drafted. The absence of all that activity suggests the shift either didn't happen or was so subtle that it's lost in the noise of normal orbital uncertainty. Let's not forget that tracking interstellar objects is genuinely difficult. These things are moving fast, they're often faint, and their orbits are influenced by factors beyond just gravity. Solar radiation pressure, even on a natural object, can produce tiny accelerations. Outgassing from specific vents on the nucleus can create asymmetric thrust. Perturbations from planets in the solar system, especially as the object passes relatively close to Earth or Mars, can alter the trajectory slightly. All of these effects are real and measurable, but they require careful analysis to disentangle from observational errors. This brings us to a critical point about how uncertainty works in science. When you measure the position of an object in the sky, you're not getting a perfect number. You're getting a number with an error bar.
Maybe your measurement is accurate to within a few arcseconds, which sounds precise until you realize that over the distances involved, a few arcseconds translates to thousands of kilometers of uncertainty in the object's actual position. When you string together multiple measurements over time to calculate an orbit, those error bars propagate. Your calculated trajectory has its own uncertainty, and for fast-moving interstellar objects with limited observation windows, that uncertainty can be significant. It's entirely possible that early observations of 3i Atlas suggested one trajectory, later observations refined it, and someone looking at the difference between the early and refined orbits interpreted that as a shift when it was really just increasing precision. The object was always on the same path, we just got better at figuring out what that path was. This kind of thing happens all the time in astronomy, and it's usually not dramatic. But if you're primed to believe something unusual is happening, if you're expecting a sudden maneuver or a hidden propulsion system, then a normal refinement of orbital parameters can look like evidence of something extraordinary. The data timeline matters here. 3i Atlas was discovered on July 1st. Perihelion was October 29th. The whistleblower claims emerged in early November. December 19th is the closest approach to Earth. If there were a legitimate sudden shift in late October, right around perihelion, you'd expect the orbit to be recalculated and updated in real time as observations poured in.
The fact that public databases show a consistent trajectory throughout this period strongly suggests no shift occurred. But the absence of evidence isn't satisfying to people who are convinced they're being lied to. It just becomes more evidence of the lie. There's a precedent for this kind of missing data mythology in space tracking communities. People convinced that certain objects are being monitored but not publicly discussed. Rumors of classified orbital elements for satellites that are officially lost. Theories about near-Earth asteroids that get flagged as potential impactors but never make it to public hazard lists because the data is suppressed to avoid panic. Most of these theories don't hold up to scrutiny, but they persist because they tap into a fundamental distrust of institutions and a belief that the public can't handle the truth. The MPEC 68 mystery sits at the intersection of these anxieties. It's specific enough to sound credible, it's obscure enough that most people won't bother verifying it,
And it's absent enough from public records that its absence can be interpreted as evidence of suppression rather than evidence of fabrication. That's a powerful combination, and it's why the whistleblower's claims have lasted this long, despite the lack of corroborating evidence. So where does that leave us? We've examined the data. We've looked at the physics. We've traced the claims to their sources and found them wanting. But understanding why the claims spread, why people believe them, and what that says about our relationship with information and authority, that's a different kind of investigation for another video.
Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.